We are believers, we are teachers, we are all God's creatures. We are opening up the doors to our home. We cherish the moments when we see our children with faith burning strong, learning at their own paces, smiles on their glowing faces. We're caring for their education. Come and join our family at Eden Hope Academy.
Hello, welcome to Eden Hope Academy. I'm Kim.
And I'm Anna.
And we are in week
19.
And what's our first card, Anna?
Our first card is South Carolina succeeds from the Union in 1860.
Cool. Okay, so what does secede mean? Does that mean that you were successful?
No, it means that you departed.
You pull away.
Yeah.
You pull away from. Okay, so let's go back through. So we definitely want to put that on, and maybe you need a picture of South Carolina on it, or maybe Fort Sumter, which we're going to talk about in just a few seconds. But what I want you to think about are the causes that led to the Civil War. So let's go way back, and let's talk about Eli Whitney, who invented the
cotton gin.
Throw one up. When he invented the cotton gin, if you remember from a few weeks ago, he took cotton and he was able to get all the yickies out of it very quickly, and so people were able to grow more cotton in the South. And when they did that, they needed to enslave more African people, and as a result, slavery went way up in the South, and the cotton production went way up too. But unfortunately, enslaving people went way up. So it really became a split country of the South, which was agrarian, which meant that they planted fields mainly, and they had enslaved people working for them. And you had the North, and it had some farms too, but they had quite a bit of factories, and the cultures were quite different. The Northerners felt that they were very sophisticated in their ways because they had factories and cities and museums. I'm snubbing you. And museums and things like that, where the Southerners were more in the era of, or in the thought process of being genteel with one another. And
being genteel with one another, we have our own factories.
And so it was a very different type of culture in the North and the South. And that was one of the things that just irritated each other, each one against each other. Another problem, so let's put up culture as one of the problems. Another problem was that the North was taxing the South. So the North, when the South would produce huge amounts of cotton, they would put it on ships and they would send most of it or much of it to Europe. And when they sent it to Europe, they would be required to dock it in a New York port, pay a tax on it, and then go to Europe. Or when it was being, when the cotton was being processed in the northern states, they would have to pay a tax before they could have it processed. Whereas the Northerners did not have to pay these taxes on their goods. And so the excessive taxes really upset the Southerners as well. So throw up that. Okay, another cause of the Civil War, another reason that South Carolina used to secede, was that the the party had just been formed, and the Republicans were adamantly opposed to slavery, and their leader, Abraham Lincoln, was elected president in 1860, in November of 1860. So throw up Abraham Lincoln. And Abraham Lincoln did not win the popular vote. He only won the electoral college vote. And that upset Southerners as well because they did not feel like they had been represented. And Southerners, in addition, did not want to follow the laws that were put in place by the Northerners that they did not like. So if, like the tariffs on the cotton, if they didn't like that, they just didn't want to follow the laws. So they were seeing themselves more and more independent and not part of the greater union. They saw the North as one side and themselves as one side, and they did not see them as one big country. So put that up as well. Okay, so there are many other factors to the Civil War, but these are some of the primary ones. And so when South Carolina seceded from the Union, other states were going through and they were taking the armaments, which are the cannon and the ammunition and the guns that the Union, the whole country, had stored in different places in the South. And people in the South were slowly confiscating these, especially after Abraham Lincoln had been elected and before he was inaugurated in that period of time. So, all right, so we're on card number 2, week 19, and we're talking about
the U.S. Civil War begins in 1861.
Okay, so let's put up some facts, Anna. So we have Republican Abraham Lincoln had just been elected. He becomes president in January of 1861, and about a month later, South Carolina it's already seceded from the Union, but there's a fort called Fort Sumter in South Carolina. So throw up a picture of Fort Sumter. And Fort Sumter had been built in 1829. It was just a very small fort. And Anderson, Major Robert Anderson, had been sent down to occupy the fort with 86 soldiers. And so these 86 soldiers were occupying the fort, and General Beauregard from the South, maybe we should say that with a Southern accent, started...
General Beauregard.
That's more French. Okay, so he had started to attack them. And it was on April the 12th, 1861. So Lincoln had just become president. And so it was a 36-hour barrage, 34-hour exchange of shooting at each other, which no one was killed. But eventually, Anderson surrendered to General Beauregard. I love that name.
We should name like a sheep that, because you know how they have huge forms.
Okay, so we're going to name our next goat or sheep General Beauregard. All right, so the North or the Union surrendered to this South Carolina, the state militia, and no one was killed during the exchange, but one person was killed right after because they had a planned 100-gun salute where everyone would shoot at the same time, and there was an explosion and one person was killed. So that's kind of awkward that they had this big battle and no one died, and then this one goofball or this one guy died from just being blown up.
Like so weird, because you're like, I made it through this big battle and then I got shot.
Yeah.
And everybody's safe.
Yeah, it's such a bummer. Okay, so that was the start of the United States Civil War. And the Civil War went on where over 600,000 people were killed. It destroyed most of the South. And it was just a horrible, horrible war. But
it ended slavery.
Ended the slavery in our country. Okay, so what's our third card?
Our third card is George Mueller lived from 1850 to 1898.
Okay, 1805 to 1898. And we've already talked about George Mueller in our last tape. But one of the things that we really need to remember about George Mueller is that his entire life, so he started out kind of a little bit worried about him, but then he accepted Jesus and his entire life changed around. And from that point on, he wanted to show people that they could live in faith. He wanted to show people that what God said was true. And when God said something in the Bible, that you could count on it. And so he lived his whole life living like that. So it says we've learned so much about not worrying in Eden Hope Academy this year. And that is what George Mueller to me epitomizes. He was not a worrying man. He would walk around with a smile on his face even when everything was crashing in on him, because he knew God's promises, and he knew that God was in charge, and he knew that God was going to take care of him and these orphans. So when you write your card about George Mueller, you can watch some of the videos below, but if you don't, and you just think about him as someone who took care of hundreds of orphans, who had big orphan houses, who educated them, fed them, clothed them, and he did all of this just relying on God, it's pretty powerful. So remember that about George Mueller, and think about ways, and I want to hear them from you, that you can be George Muellers in your life and having no worries because you know that God is in charge. So we'll see you next week. Thank you so much.